and welcome to this special edition of Econtalk on CGTN. I'm Guan Xing. With the G20 summit right around the corner, expectations and stakes are high as global leaders prepare to convene in India. As host nation, India faces major challenges in bridging divisions among member countries and forging consensus on key issues, from climate change to debt relief. So how can G20 leaders work through their differences to take decisive action on shared global priorities? Can the G20 adapt to give greater voice to developing countries most impacted by global crisis? We have an esteemed panel of experts joining us to provide insights into the key issues and challenges facing the G20 nations, and they are Nelson Wang, Vice Chairman of the Shanghai Center for RIMPAC Strategy and International Studies. Welcome.
Thank you.
And John Ross, Senior Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University. Mr. Ross was formerly Director of Economic and Business Policy for the Mayor of London as well. Thank you for joining us.
Pleased to be here.
And Sara Gupta, Resident Fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for the invite.
And Yus Riza Demery, Executive Director of Center for Strategic and International Studies. Well, thank you for your time as well.
Yeah, good afternoon, all of you.
Well, let's start with Mr. Gupta because India is hosting the G20 this year. What is your take on the most pressing issues and challenges facing the G20 nations as the leaders gather for this summit? How to advance its mandate of promoting economic growth, financial stability, and global development amid increasingly complex international environment?
It's a proud moment for India to be hosting the event. India has always wanted its moment in the sun. It's finally getting its moment in the sun, and it is doing reasonably well economically at home, although it could do a lot better. It has a lot of challenges, of course, domestically, but right now, as chair, the larger challenges is coordinating, basically herding all the cats together at the G20 summit. And I think the problem for India out here has been that India itself has been sort of running with the hares and hunting with the hounds in terms of where it stands on the most divisive issue going into the G20, which is the Ukraine issue, because it has played both sides and in joint statements too. And the problem arising out here is that at large multilateral venues, it is the Western countries which put their foot down and demand that there is a strong statement against Russia, essentially. But when India sits with these Western countries in those little minilateral blocks or groupings like the Quad, they give India a pass essentially for India's position out there, and they are able to put out joint statements very clearly. So basically, if the Western countries would relent a little bit and focus the topic, the subject of the G20 more on economics and development, of which there are many, many challenges and which we will uncertain talk about, I think we can have a little more harmony. Otherwise, I'm afraid we'll again have the chair putting out an outcome document, trying to harmonize positions. But at the end of the day, I think it's been India running with the hares, hunting with the hounds, which has then created this situation where it's not being able to hammer a consensus on some of the most critical issues, including the Ukraine issue, the Ukraine conflict.
Definitely, that's right. And that is one of the key challenges facing the world today, to bridging the differences, especially on some of the key issues. We know that Indonesia was hosting the G20 last year. How successful was Indonesia in solving these global problems amid these uncertainties around the world? I would like to turn to Mr. Demery for that.
Yes, thank you very much for the questions. And I think Indonesia was, to some extent, quite successful. At least in Bali, the leaders managed to get the declarations. But we have to admit that this time is really difficult time for G20 and also for other global cooperation initiative. Like, for example, you mentioned also about bridging the diverse interests among its members, and even maintaining cohesion in G20 is quite challenging at this time. without even the geopolitical tensions and rivalry among major powers. Actually, the aspirations among the G20 members, it's becoming, or the gap is becoming widening. Even in the areas where interests are in line, take for examples on multilateral trading systems. Everybody agree, all countries agree that the multilateral trading systems need to be reformed, but on how to do that and what to be addressed, what to be reformed, there would be a big disagreements. Also on debt issue, for example, the last year's Bali declarations explicitly mentioned to reiterate our commitment, their commitment to step up efforts to implement the common framework for debt treatments beyond the debt service suspension initiative. But today, in India, we see that it's not really progressing well. Only two countries actually are under this common framework initiative, and the problems of debt in many developing countries are even becoming more important at the moment. So again, G20 really need to do a lot of more homework about it.
Indeed, and I want to go to Mr. Wang because China also firmly upholds multilateralism. Do you think multilateralism still works at this G20 with so many divisions on a lot of key issues?
Well, multilateralism is a buzzword that has been going on around the world for quite a few years, actually, and it's becoming more and more popular these days. But whether multilateralism is already a reality or is something to be cherished for, that's something I think it really depends on the perspectives everybody takes. But to me, I think multilateralism is already a reality. But it's a matter of how we can all come together, the developed countries and the developing countries, how these two groups of countries can come together instead of separating from each other. So I always hold the opinion that the world and tomorrow is not going to be made better if we split the world into two competing camps again. So the whole economy around the world is already interwoven, and countries are dependent upon each other. No country can survive alone all by itself these days, because this is the 21st century. We're not living in the past. We have to move forward. And that's why I think in order to make multilateralism a reality, I think all countries, and particularly the G20 summit, I think these countries represent, by and large, some of the leading forces of world economy. And so these countries need to come together and talk and to come to compromises and understanding on all the issues that we confront as mankind.
Indeed. And last but not least, Mr. Ross, I know your work plays a very important role in bridging the gap between the East and the West and in promoting understanding between the two sides. What is your view on this, and how do we seek consensus and cooperation in the world today?
Well, the most fundamental thing that you've got to do is start by looking at the facts and not engaging in fantasies. And I'm afraid, particularly in the US media in the last period, there's been a great deal of fantasizing going rather than addressing the facts. So let's look at what's happened during the last 4 years. The real big problem, and this is the real problem that G20 has got to address, is the very slow growth in the advanced countries. If we take the average for the last 4 years, the US has grown at less than 2% a year. Europe is a disaster area. It's grown at less than 0.5% a year. This is incredibly slow growth. China's been growing at 4.5% a year, basically 2.5 times as fast as the United States and 6 times as fast as the Eurozone. But instead of addressing this real situation, the US seems engaged in a fantasy that China's got great problems. I mean, all countries have got some problems emerging out of the COVID situation. This was one of the biggest economic disasters since World War II. But let's say one person's got, I won't say the plague, let's say scarlet fever. So if take the US, I don't think the US has got the plague. I don't think it's going to die or something like that, but it's got some serious economic problems. And China's got a problem of a cold or influenza. And the US spends its time pointing at China and saying, oh, look, you've got a problem, you've got a cold and influenza, when we've ignoring the fact that it's got some more serious problems. The most serious problem that's got to be addressed by the G20 is the developing countries are growing reasonably well, China very well, India pretty well, and ASEAN pretty well, and the developed countries are growing absolutely appallingly slowly. And that's the real problem. The real problem that should be on the G20 address is why are the advanced economies growing so slowly? And how can the global south avoid the consequences of this? That's the real situation. But unless you're prepared to face up and discuss the actual facts of the economic situation, you can't even ask the right questions.
Well, thank you very much for your insights on this. And now let's turn to some economic issues, because fostering economic growth in the post-pandemic era is still of paramount importance to other countries. And many lower-income countries are facing debt distress and risks of default as they try to recover from the pandemic. So what can the G20 do to provide debt relief or restructuring while maintaining global financial stability? Mr. Gupta?
Actually, that is the one area where the membership has been very, very focused this year. And part of the reason that it had been very focused this year is because the US has pushed unusually hard on this front. Right from the beginning of the year, Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary, has been talking in terms of finding ways, new financing mechanisms to tackle debt distress, and also to enable many developing countries to have money to make those investments in greening their economies, which will take a lot of money and it needs to catalyze a lot of private finance. And so she's talked in terms of expansion of the balance sheets of the multilateral banks, being creative in that way, recapitalizing. All this is good. But here's my problem where the US wakes up one day and says what I would frame as on-demand cooperation. Okay, today I want cooperation on this, and that. Which are good, which is good for the global economy, good for developing countries and for everybody. But also, I mean, it's not the only agenda setter. And again, talking in terms of additional financing, how come we won't have additional financing in terms for the IMF, in terms of a new quota review, which will expand the capacity and the voting power of emerging economies? No, we don't go out there because, maybe that's a challenge to the US. So this sort of on-demand cooperation where I would like to do it and I don't care about the others, it's not a very useful way to proceed. And we've seen that, for example, and let me bring another example from a little time back. This is the OECD wrote out new rules for global corporate taxation rules. Global taxation rules are based on 20th century manufacturing activity. We are in the services and digital age. And so they had a very difficult framework on which there's a consensus. And folks signed off on it, including the US, and now the US wants to break that consensus. And so what the United States pushed, it now does not want to go ahead and implement it. And this creates real challenges in the international system. US has on-demand cooperation. It's trying to do good for developing countries, but won't give them a voice in choosing how to have local ownership of these projects. And it does, at the end of the day, this is where the challenges in coordinating within the G20 between the North and the South really crops up, because it's my way or the highway. And that's not the way global multilateralism needs to work. And so, I mean, I tend to think that is a very serious problem, why we are not making sufficient progress on many of these issues on which there is existing consensus.
That's right. Well, a key message from India this year is to give more voices to the developing countries which are hit the hardest by the global crisis. One of such crises is climate crisis. So given the current geopolitical tensions and economic headwinds, is this still optimistic to have important climate action needed and commitments from this summit, Mr. Damuri?
Well, I think it can be the current geopolitical tensions also can have two different outcome actually on the way that we try to fight the climate change issue. On the first one, of course, it may undermine our effort because the collaborations and cooperations would be more difficult to do under these global situations. But on the other hand, it might also increase the incentive for countries in order to become more fast. In order to become more friendly toward the climate mitigations, like for example, on transitioning to the green economy, the competition, if managed quite well, then it would provide more incentive and also more initiative from the different actors. So perhaps what we need to do is just to keep the cooperations ongoing for sure, and then try to make this kind of competitions also provide more benefit, provide more incentive toward the evolutions or the discovery of new and new innovations, new technology on the transition toward the green economy.
Right. Mr. Wang, in your opinion, what economic issues are topping the agenda and what more concrete actions can be taken from issues like technology governance to supply chain resilience?
Well, economically, there are so many issues that are on the table for every country and globally as well. But I think we are moving into the new age where AI is becoming part of our life already. And I think and I hope that this issue is going to be touched upon during the G20 summit. We also know that there is an upcoming summit which is going to take place in the UK about AI, and then there has been a lot of talks about whether to invite China or not. But personally, I think it will be a real mistake that China is not invited because, China is already quite ahead in terms of AI development. But for technology, I think the world is going through some tremendous changes, whereby China has always been kind of under the spotlight, that the US is apparently doing a lot of things and trying their best to contain China's development with the chip war, with all kinds of sanctions against Chinese companies. But what I would like to point out here is I think in order to achieve a better understanding, to have a more cohesive world, as we would hope it, is that for developed countries, what they need to do is to swallow the pride, to accept the fact that the world has changed, because change is the only thing that never gets changed. But on the other hand, for developing countries like China, like India, like Indonesia, and many other developing countries, I think it's their objective is how to be recognized globally as well. So it's basically, it takes two to tango. You can't have a peaceful world where the upcoming countries are struggling very hard to be recognized that I'm coming up, I'm number one, number two, number three. No, let's come together. In the meantime, the developed countries will also have a better kind of mindset to accept the fact that the world has changed and to swallow the pride, perhaps, because otherwise, with the US as the only superpower that never wants to give up its supremacy, this is where all the problems are coming up. And I've noticed our friend from India, Indonesia, and Mr. Ross, they've all made very valid points, actually. So it shows that if we come together and talk, I think we can still try to accomplish something.
And Mr. Ross, what do you think are the fundamental things beneath those East-West split and it feels either in economically or in technologically, because there is some certain caution against China in the Western world in the development of technology. What is the outlook for tech governance cooperation among G20 nations?
Well, I'm afraid it's probably not very good. Because the US is trying to do something which is impossible. And as long as it continues to do something which is impossible, the situation is going to be difficult to go. What is it trying to do? The average growth rate of the US is 2%. That's its average growth rate for the last 20 years. It's also the official projections for the US. If the US wants to try to remain the largest economy in the world, that means that China has also got to grow at 2% or less than 2%. And this is not going to happen. And therefore, the US is attempting to stop China's growth, and this is creating all sorts of tensions. Instead, they've got another problem coming down the line, which is at the present time, the United States is obsessed by the fact that they're going to be overtaken economically by China in size, which is going to happen. It's going to happen sometime during the next 10 years. But then they've got a second shock coming, which is in about 20 years' time, they're going to the question's going to be raised, they're going to be overtaken by India. By 2050, the US is going to be number 3 in the world. That's the reality. I don't know whether China or India will be number 1, but it'll be one of the two, just because due to the population. And the US will be number 3. This is a terrible psychological adjustment for them. To go from being number 1 in the world to number 3 in the world, it was bad enough for my country. Which at least succeeded in avoiding having a war with the United States, to go from number 1 country in the world to I don't know where we are now, in terms of economy, 9, 10, depending on how you measure it. And the US is trying to achieve something impossible by technology boycotts, tax means, fake propaganda, all sorts of things, and it's not going to work. And as long as the US continues to try to do something which is impossible, it's going to create tensions in the world. What the US instead should be looking at, instead of trying to hold other people back, is why is our growth rate only 2%? What can we do about it? How can we speed it up? I thought it was well put by President Xi Jinping. It says if you spend your time trying to put out other people's lights, it's not going to make your own lamp any brighter. And this is the underlying source of the problem. The United States trying to maintain a position where it's number 1 in the world when it's not going to be. We're going to go through a rough several decades as the United States is forced to adjust to this situation. I very much hope peacefully, because at least Britain had the sense to accept it's not going to be number 1 peacefully. That was a very sensible thing it did. I hope the US shows the same sense. I hope this transition will take place peacefully, but we're in for several dangerous decades.
That's right, and we really should not be so obsessed with ranking, but there is a room for every country to prosper. Every people have the rights to develop. And the G20 has been criticized for not giving enough voice to developing countries. Mr. Gupta, do you think proposals like adding an African nation seat will gain traction?
It will gain traction, but it goes down to the fundamental problem of, yes, they're assembled in the room, but they're not really the agenda setters. And when it comes down to actually filling out the details of many of these issues, it's the global north which kind of leads that process. And the global south is asked to swallow that, even if it is to their benefit, but on the terms of the global north. And where the global north cannot meet its commitments, for example, I think the most probably notable one is that they said we're going to give 100 billion a year with regard to climate change. and they hemmed and hawed and tried to pretend that they were doing until at the last COP, I think COP27, they finally admitted, cannot do, we've not done. And they didn't have any. And the irony is now that Presidential Special Envoy John Kerry, when he came to China recently in July, he quietly wanted China then to also start putting money with the global north as a donor nation. And thereafter, China would be treated as essentially a developed country, not a developing country in climate, with regard to climate change financing, at least. And so, I mean, this gets to part of the nub of the problem, where burdens need to be equally shared and the agenda set up and ownership needs to be equally felt. And I don't think that aspect is going to really change within the G20. As I was talking, Secretary Yellen is doing good, but I mean, on terms which are really not enamoring to the global South. And what I would say to the countries in the global South is that don't just seek voice, don't just seek voting power, try actually to have real intellectual contribution to how changes can be made. And we saw an element of that. I think it was the Barbadian Prime Minister who put out something called the Bridgetown Initiative in terms of how at the G20 and at the multilateral level, financing that the risks that developing countries face even at the time of receiving financing in terms of trade shocks or in terms of exchange rate shocks, how those could be kind of managed to their favor. So it's that sort of developing country intellectual resources going forward and trying to really shape the agenda. I think that also is lacking. So the Global South has its share of work to also do if we are going to have a more balanced agenda and we're going to go forward, I mean, hand in hand together, trying to find solutions to problems which ultimately which ultimately will come back to haunt the global north also, as we see in terms of migration, et cetera, if these are not resolved.
Indeed, a lot to start with. And Mr. Damouri, in your opinion, how to give equitable voices to different parties involved and how to help them to not only speak their voice, but also really benefit from the multilateralism?
Yeah, I agree with Mr. Gupta. It's more than just providing the platforms to other developing countries to join the G20, for example. I think first we need to understand that among developing countries itself, the voice is not really coherent. It is difficult to align the differences and come up with coherent voices of developing countries. The gap between developing countries are quite huge, actually, much bigger than among developed nations, and their aspirations as well as their interests are also quite has a huge gap, and I think. We also need to know that many developing countries, or at least less developed countries, do not really have sufficient knowledge about their own interests and aspirations. Normally, they know what they don't want, but they do not know what they really want. So I think that's why we rarely hear any alternative ideas coming from developing nations or from the less developed nations on various global issues. Take, for example, the narrative of climate change, climate mitigations, and green transition always come from the West, from more developed nations, and rarely we hear some alternative ideas coming from the less developed nations. And another thing is also, as Mr. Gupta already highlight, this is not only about number, this is also about how to provide more resources, actually, to get and to be able to voice their interests, and then to be able to contribute to the agenda settings under G20 and also under many other platforms.
Mr. Wang, I want to turn to you because we know that China several years ago has proposed the idea as well, and China firmly supported the African Union to gain a seat. In your opinion, how would this likely to change the agenda setting of G20, and what is the impact?
Well, the African people and the entire continent of Africa deserve not only to be paid more attention to, but it also represents the future of the world, actually, given the young population and the vast continent and also the resources. It is possible that in 20, 30 years' time from now, the attention of the world might be shifted towards Africa. And it's also something that we definitely need to look at. There is a lot of competition going on already in Africa by the different forces around the world. So, I think China is right to have raised the issue and the initiative that to bring representatives from Africa to appear at the G20 summit. But I think for every G20 summit, what we can expect is that it is not a celebration party. The purpose of G20 summit is something that it creates a platform for people to exchange their ideas, to address common issues, problems, and disagreements are bound to happen. But I think it's a matter of diplomacy and understanding and wisdom of our leaders, of our different country leaderships, to try to come together to make compromises and understanding. Political issues, economic issues are always interwoven. You can't talk about politics without mentioning economics. Vice versa is the same. So there are so many disagreements among countries these days. While multilateralism is the buzzword, is the way forward, but also we have to admit that we are already in the days of disorder globally at the moment. But I'm not going to say this is good or bad, but it's a reality. It means that the world is moving and sailing into uncharted waters that needs the cooperation, the collaborative effort of all countries.
Indeed, we have a shared destiny as the humankind. And Mr. Ross, what is your perspective on this, especially from the G7 countries? Do you think this will help promote cooperation between the South and the North or not?
Well, I think there's two processes involved. The first is there are very important processes taking place whereby the global South is getting its act together. I agree. It's a bit like somebody said herding cats. I think it's quite as bad as that. But you've now got a new phenomenon which is taking place. You had first, that was the Belt and Road Initiative by China itself. That's got 149 countries in it, the great majority of which are developing countries. That was a step forward. But secondly, I think of greater importance was the recent BRICS summit and the decision to expand BRICS, because BRICS is now in purchasing power parities. That's real economic terms, real prices. Has got as big as output as the G7, and it's much more rapidly growing. So what I see as a phenomenon, which is what I call a new non-alignment. This new non-alignment is different. The old non-alignment was a political one. It came out of the Bandung Conference, the official launch in 1961 of the non-aligned movement. This was very important politically, but quite honestly, it wasn't terribly important economically. The new thing which is happening with BRICS is that this is extremely important economically. And why have you got such a extraordinary range of countries in it? I mean, you've got Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Brazil, Argentina. I mean, these are extremely diverse from the point of view of economic strategy. They're extraordinarily diverse from the point of view of political system. You've got a monarchy, Saudi Arabia. You've got a socialist country, China. You've got all sorts of republics. Pretty hard to imagine a wider, diverse range of political systems than this. Why have they come together? Well, why have they come together is because they want to develop production and go forward. These are relatively rapidly growing economies. And the US system dominates, it's not allowing them to do so. It gets in the way. The manipulation of the dollar by sanctions has become outrageous. Even countries which are allies of the United States are taking situations to try to avoid this problem. The technology boycotts have become a serious problem. These are damaging South Korean companies, Japanese companies, US companies. So these countries are coming together, not in a negative sense against the US, but in order to go forward, they've got to come together, and they don't agree with what the US is doing. And they don't have a row with the US. No country which is sensible wants to have an argument with the United. Why pick a powerful enemy? But they're forced to come together, and therefore this BRICS development is extremely important. It's because of these economic processes that you have very different countries coming together. I mean, in a certain sense, it's sort of global ASEAN. In ASEAN, you've got everything. You've got socialism in China and Vietnam. You've got a monarchy in Thailand. You've got all sorts of republics. And it's the biggest economic success area in the whole world. Doesn't want political uniformity, wants to get on with economic development. And what I think you're seeing in BRICS is the same type of sort of globalized development of ASEAN. I mean, it's not as structurally consulted as ASEAN, but it represents the same type of tendency. So I know that there are problems in the global south, but there are good signs that the global south is getting its act together more.
So, Mr. Gupta, let me turn to you. So in the face of this shifting global order, what opportunity and challenge do you see for India's leadership to reshape the existing global order, and what is your vision for it?
India is going to have difficulty on its own, and even within BRICS, because it's not the leading light within the BRICS, frankly. And there is a degree of competition with China, which creates which kind of can gum up the state of progress within the BRICS system itself. But the larger issue, the question that you're raising is, how can we move forward more productively together as a group? And I think many of the global south countries have shown that. I think that what we heard from Professor Ross on the BRICS is exactly that. Countries are rising above their differences on one simple common agenda: defend their right to development. It's as simple as that. In the post-Cold War, World War, these last 30 years, developing countries have tasted the fruits of development and prosperity, and they are saying, you are not going to take that away from us. And there's no reason to take that away. The problem has been that in the global north, much of growth has come to a standstill, or it's not growing as well, because it's also aging. And therefore, we have the rise of populism and economic nationalism. But that is not the story of the global south or the developing countries or the emerging markets. For them, they saw the last 30 years as a tremendous opportunity, which can go on for the next 50 years. And so for them, it's about coming together, and countries like India, countries like China, leading the charge, saying that the globalization that we had was a good one, and that needs to be protected. And frankly, I would say there are voices in the global north, even in places where there is the rise of populism, for example, in Europe, who understand the value of economic liberalism and trade liberalization. Folks like the Japanese, the Koreans, the European Union, they are invested in the global, now when I say rules-based order, one almost always thinks of the Americans. Let me talk of the UN-centered international economic order. They are invested in that. And therefore, what I would say to the global south and to its leading lights like India and China is to engage those parts of the global north which are committed to globalization: Australia, Canada, European Union, And there will be folks who are like maybe the Americans who take a more a la carte approach, whether it's only interest based, where they will pursue economic globalization or economic cooperation. Let that be the case, but at least work with those who already the consensus exists, and there's a fairly broad enough consensus in parts of the global north, and it's the global south, to reach out to them saying, we will protect that UN-centered system, and in the course of doing so, we will revitalize and renew the institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions like the bank, like the IMF. We will come up with ideas now, so that even though if those ideas cannot come to fruition now, there might be that moment. Think exactly 100 years back. I mean, the World War I over, the countries wanted to come together, but there was a lot of fractiousness. Of course, there were after war, after a terrible war. But many of those ideas of the 1920s and 1930s, which were not allowed to get played out because they were overcome by the politics of the times and that age, were then captured in that 1945 order. That 1945 order was not something which came from heaven, like manna dropping from heaven. Those were ideas which percolated beneath in the 1920s and 1930s. And then when that moment came in 1945, they were captured in that system. That is where the global north, global south needs to go in providing ideas and intellectual leaderships. The China and the India, how the international development finance system, monetary system, international public health architecture, how we can do reforms so that when the moment is propitious, we can work with amenable parties, cooperative parties in the global north, and recreate a new and better order. I think that's the sort of leadership should be looking for. And it won't happen over just one G20 summit. It's an ongoing, continuous process.
Right. Let me take this to Mr. Damari, because Indonesia just hosted the ASEAN Summit. What can we learn from ASEAN Summit in promoting economic cooperation and integration? And do you think there are some certain level of reforms needed for G20 as the premium global economic governance platform?
Well, G20 has done a lot actually to the economic cooperations and also global cooperations in general. We have to admit it. But of course, the problem is that we have bigger challenges in front of us in the future. So we need to get this platforms to become more effective. And then, unfortunately, the current situations do not really provide a good environment for having an effective platform, G20 platform, G20 discussions, in order to get the good, effective cooperations. That you have to get at least three aspects, three elements in that cooperation. The first one is the trust. And we know that the trust among G20 members are nowadays are not really in a good situations. We have, even we can say that we have the deficit in trust. President Xi Jinping, for example, would not go to the G20 summit tomorrow. And then it may also be interpreted as a less, there would be less trust being developed in the summit. The second one is that we have to be able to align the interests among nations, and as we already discussed, it has been very difficult to do. And the third one is that we have to get the sufficient implementation mechanism. Appropriate implementation mechanisms, and G20 as informal platforms do not really have that kind of implementation mechanism, unlike ASEAN, for example, who has the good structured body with a very quite developed implementation mechanism. Of course, G20 has G20 has to rely on the international organizations to carry out all their commitments. But unfortunately, our international organizations have been developed in the way like 40 or 50 years ago, with very different situations. We also need to do some reforms on that international organization, so that the G20 aspiration, G20 commitments can also be carried out by those international organizations.
You rightly pointed out that China, Chinese Premier Li Qiang will be representing China at the G20 summit for the first time. But the Foreign Ministry also said China has all along attached great importance to and taken an active part in G20 events. Mr. Wang, what is your perspective on this? What role do you expect China to play at this year's G20? And what is China's views and visions for such global institutions like G20 and BRICS and other regional and cooperative institutions?
China is certainly taking a more and more active role in global governance over the last few years, and it's becoming even more so in the years ahead, which is something to be expected. I think G20, as some of our friends in the panel have touched upon, G20 is not an implementation organization, is not something that has an executive function to make things happen tomorrow. It's more of a platform for country leaders to exchange their views, to mitigate the misunderstandings and trying to avoid some risks. Whereas you also mentioned about other platforms like the BRICS. Yes, the BRICS is an upcoming a global platform that it is actually really quite interesting because, as Mr. Ross has mentioned, geopolitically, it represents countries from Latin America, from Asia, Africa, and then now the Middle East, and also Russia. So it's basically so representative that it is not something like the EU, like Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It is different. So this actually shows that the world is changing. And the global South is coming together for what? Not to fight against the global North, but to voice out their disagreements of how the world has been governed until today, because it is not working anymore. So it's a call for change, basically. But what I would say is that for all these new organizations, and particularly for countries of the global South, it is perhaps more important also to think about how to engage countries in the so-called global North, because I'm still against the idea of separating the world. I think it has to come together. It has to come together. It is going to be difficult, not easy. A lot of things are easier said than done, as always. But this is why we're here. And the world is only going to move forward instead of backward. So it takes a lot of wisdom, a lot of gut, and a lot of commitment, actually, to make things happen. So China should be complimented in that respect for promoting these new initiatives to, to promote this future of a shared destiny. And that's something that needs to be recognized and complimented. Thank you.
Indeed. Well, the Cold War mindset is harmful to the global economy. Mr. Ross, I'd like to go to you in our final question, because on issues like trade, technology, and security, China and the U.S. seems to be on divergent paths. So how will this lead to negotiations spilling into the G20, and can we expect at least some development, some progress on this, because we're also seeing high-level exchanges between China and the U.S., the two largest economies. What is your expectation for it? What are the low-hanging fruits?
Well, the expectations are twofold. One is, it is certainly a good thing that the United States has decided that it wants to talk. As one leading British statesman said, jaw is better than war. And therefore that's very good. On some areas, there may be possible to make progress. On the question of climate change, this is a problem that can't be solved without the cooperation of the United States and China. And I think actually the Biden administration is actually serious about the question of climate change. I obviously don't know what the proposals that were put forward by Kerry were, because they were discussed with China. But my general judgment of Biden is he doesn't have the type of mad position of Trump that climate change doesn't exist and all that type of thing. So that is a certain area. If I was in China, I'd want to explore it, see what was going on, and have perhaps some hope that something could come out of this. On the question of technology, I'm afraid I'm a bit pessimistic, because I think that the United States falsely believes that it can hold back China's development by technology boycotts, etc. It has some ridiculous idea that China is copying the United States and is primarily progressing technologically by stealing things from the United States. This is absurd. I mean, I thought it was very well put by the head of Huawei, who said, when there was an attack on Huawei, he said, how can I steal the intellectual property of the United States? I produce things that they can't produce. So how can I be stealing from them? This will cause some damage. Or let's take TikTok. There used to be a thing, China can't produce brands, was a big thing. I remember reading books 10 years ago. You know, that China's okay for commodity production. We understand they're good at that, but they can't produce brands. Okay, look at TikTok. TikTok is now the most visited website in the world. The president of the United States got a problem because he says he wants to ban TikTok, but the problem is that 120 million Americans have got TikTok on their phone. And as one commentator put it, it's not a very good idea politically to pick an argument with 120 million people. So all this type of thing is not going to work. Does it cause problems for individual companies in China over some period? Yes, it can. It did significant damage for a period of time to Huawei's mobile phone business. But now Huawei's now coming back with its own highly developed telephones. Will this cause some problems for China? Yes, I don't want to downplay it. Everything would be better if we didn't engage in such things, and the whole world would go faster and the United States companies would make more profit. But the technological innovation of China is absolutely the equal of the United States. I don't believe that a single Chinese person is better than a single American person, or vice versa. I think they got equal levels of intelligence, equal levels of stupidity, that China's therefore going to advance technologically. And this is another example of the United States trying to do what is impossible. It's not going to be able to hold back China. As long as the US economy remains locked in 2% growth, the attempt to prevent China growing faster than the US, that means to knock China's growth rate down from about 5% a year to 2% a year, which is what it's trying to do, is simply not going to work. And is going to create a great deal of tension. I would like to say that this idea has got through to the United States and they were going to change their minds on it, but eventually they will. But I'm not very optimistic, frankly, at this G20 meeting. I think climate change we may get somewhere. On technology, I think there's going to be some banging of heads. Unfortunately, I don't welcome it. I don't think. China doesn't want confrontation. No one should want confrontation. But the United States, as long as it continues to do things which are impossible, is going to create problems. So I'm not terribly optimistic. Wish I could give you the opposite answer, but that's my honest estimate of the situation.
That's right. And if China's economy slows down, that will also hit the U.S. economy. And let's have more cooperation, at least some fair competition for the innovative economy to prosper. And thank you so much. And that wraps up our discussion today. And I want to thank our distinguished guests again. Nelson Wang, Vice Chairman of the Shanghai Center for RIMPAC Strategic and International Studies. John Ross, Senior Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University. And Saurabh Gupta, Resident Senior Fellow at the Institute for China-American Studies, and Yus Rizzo Damuri, Executive Director of Center for Strategic and International Studies, for sharing your invaluable insights with us. So the G20 summit comes at a pivotal moment for international cooperation and leadership. The issues we explore today, from climate action to reforming global governance, are complex and multifaceted. While consensus may not always be possible, our panelists offered important perspectives on building bridges, finding common ground, and adapting institutions like the G20 to be more inclusive of diverse voices. And that's all for this edition of Econtalk. I'm Guanxing in Beijing. Until next time, bye for now.